at 7:30 in the morning on the 1st of July 1916, over 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches on the Somme and began the walk towards the German lines. By the end of that day, 19,240 of them were dead. It remains to this day the bloodiest single day in the entire history of the British Army, worse than any day of the Second World War and worse than any other day of the First. This video is about how that happened. Not just the famous image of lions led by donkeys, but a deeper story, a battle born out of desperation to save an ally, fought with a plan that broke down within minutes of 0 hour against an enemy who was dug in far more strongly than anyone in British headquarters believed. And it's about a myth, a very persistent myth, about why so many German positions survived the bombardment that was supposed to destroy them. We'll also end by asking a rather strange question. Why is the Somme, a battle that by any military measure was a catastrophe for the British Army, is remembered in Britain today with something closer to pride than shame? On the 21st of February 1916, the German Chief of the General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, launched a massive offensive against the French fortress city of Verdun. Falkenhayn's stated aim, at least according to his post-war memoir, was not really to capture the city. It was to bleed the French army white, to attack a position so symbolically and militarily important to France that the French would be compelled to defend it at any cost, feeding division after division into a meat grinder of German artillery. Whether Falkenhayn actually wrote that memo before the battle or rationalised it afterwards is something historians still argue about. The so-called Christmas Memorandum he claimed to have given the Kaiser has never been found in archives, but regardless of the original intention, that's exactly what Verdun became. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre and the French military leadership committed to holding the city, and the result was one of the longest and most costly battles in human history. By the time it finally ended in December 1916, Verdun had cost the two sides somewhere in the region of 700,000 casualties combined, for almost no strategic change in the front line at all. By the spring of 1916, the French army was bleeding badly, and it showed no sign of stopping. This put colossal pressure on Britain's strategic plans. Back in December 1915, at the Chantilly Conference, the Entente powers, Britain, France, Russia and Italy, had agreed to a coordinated set of offensives in 1916 designed to attack Germany and Austria-Hungary on multiple fronts simultaneously, preventing the Central Powers from shifting reserves between fronts. The original plan for the Somme sector, worked out between the British commanders Sir Douglas Haig and Joffre, envisioned a substantial French-led attack. General Ferdinand Foch had proposed the French would deploy as many as 42 divisions on a wide front south of the river, with a supporting British attack of around 25 divisions to the north. Verdun tore this plan apart. As French divisions were pulled away to feed the meat grinder at Verdun, the Somme offensive transformed from a French-led operation with British support into the exact opposite, a predominantly British operation with a relatively modest French contribution. By the time the attack actually launched, the French commitment on the Somme had shrunk to around 5 divisions on an 8-mile front, while the British were committing 11 divisions of the 4th Army on a front roughly 15 miles wide to the north of the river. The Somme was not originally conceived as a Great British offensive to win the war in one stroke. It became the main Allied effort on the Western Front almost by default because the army that was supposed to lead it was busy somewhere else. Haig himself was uneasy about the timing. He had wanted more time to train the new largely volunteer British divisions, the famous Kitchener's Army, and would have preferred to attack later in the summer, possibly in Flanders rather than the Somme at all. But Joffre pressed him hard, reportedly telling Haig at one meeting that the French army would cease to exist if Britain did not attack soon. Haig, under enormous diplomatic and military pressure to relieve his ally, agreed to bring the date forward. So when the British guns opened up along the Somme front in the last days of June 1916, they weren't firing as part of some confident, unhurried masterstroke. They were firing in large part because the French army at Verdun was getting desperate and needed the pressure taken off, even if the British army wasn't fully ready. For 7 days before the infantry went over the top, from the 24th of June to the morning of the 1st of July, British and French artillery subjected the German lines to one of the heaviest bombardments seen up to that point in the war. Roughly 1.7 million shells were fired into a relatively narrow strip of German-held territory. General Sir Henry Rawlinson, commanding the British Fourth Army that would carry out the main attack, was reported to have told his men with total confidence that nothing could possibly survive in the area covered by that bombardment. The plan was built almost entirely around that assumption, that week-long barrage would flatten the German wire, collapse German trenches, and kill or so thoroughly demoralise the defenders that British infantry could simply walk across no man's land in long straight lines at a steady pace and occupy the German positions with minimal resistance. This is one of the most famous and most damaging miscalculations of the entire war, and it failed for several overlapping reasons. The first was depth. German positions on the Somme front had been held uninterrupted since late 1914. They had used that time, nearly 2 years, to dig some of the most sophisticated defensive works yet seen in the war. Deep dugouts, in places dug 30 to 40 feet underground, were carved into the chalk subsoil of Picardy, strong enough to withstand all but a direct hit from the heaviest guns. When the bombardment began, German troops simply withdrew into these dugouts and waited it out. British planners had assumed defences roughly equivalent to what had been encountered earlier in the war. What they were actually attacking was a far more developed defensive system than anyone at British headquarters had fully appreciated. They were tasked with destroying wire, suppressing artillery, hitting second and third defensive lines, and disrupting German communications all across a wide front. And the sheer quantity of artillery, while unprecedented for the British Army at that point, was still spread thin relative to the scale of what it was being asked to destroy. There were simply not enough heavy guns relative to the size of the target to guarantee saturation everywhere. The third reason was the quality and type of ammunition. A substantial number of British shells failed to detonate on impact, and unexploded ordnance from the Somme, the locals call it the Iron Harvest, is dug up in fields even today. Britain entered the war catastrophically unprepared for the sheer industrial scale of artillery warfare on the Western Front. By the spring of 1915, this had become a full-blown political scandal, the so-called shell crisis of 1915, when newspapers, including the Times, reported that British troops were going into battles without enough shells to sustain an offensive. The scandal helped bring down the Asquith's government's original structure and led directly to the creation of a new Ministry of Munitions, headed by the new Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George, whose entire job was to increase British industrial output to the scale the war now demanded. The way Britain solved this shell shortage was, in large part, through enormous wartime expansion of the female industrial workforce. By the end of the war, Somewhere between 700,000 and around 1 million women had worked as munitionettes in British war industry, and by some estimates, these women were responsible for producing as much as 80% of the weaponry and shells reaching the front by the later years of the war. At 7:29 AM, 2 minutes before the infantry assault, several enormous mines that had been tunnelled under key German positions were detonated, including the colossal Lochnagar mine near La Bossière, which threw a crater roughly 90 metres across and was reportedly heard in London. At 7:30 AM precisely, whistles blew along the British line and the men began climbing out of their trenches. What followed has become, in Britain, the defining image of the First World War: long lines of men walking across open ground into German machine guns. But why walk? The official reasoning, reflected in 4th Army training instructions issued before the battle, was that heavily laden infantry simply could not run across broken, cratered ground without breaking formation, and since the bombardment was expected to have destroyed German resistance, there was no need to run. Soldiers were instructed to advance at a steady walking pace in evenly spaced waves, to keep formation, and to allow following waves to leapfrog forward in good order to consolidate captured positions. It is important to say that this was not a universal rule applied identically everywhere. Some divisions, particularly further south, used more flexible tactics, advanced in small groups or attacked before dawn under better cover, and where this happened, results were sometimes much better. But across most of the front, particularly the northern sectors around Serre, Beaumont-Hamel, Thiepval and Ovillers, the rigid walking pace assault into intact German wire and machine guns turned into a catastrophe within minutes. The accounts from men who survived that morning make for some of the most horrific reading of the entire war. Lieutenant Alfred Bundy, advancing with his platoon, described the moment German fire opened up. My platoon continued to advance in good order without many casualties and had reached halfway to the Boche line. Suddenly, an appalling rifle and machine gun fire opened up against us and my men commenced to fall. I shouted "down," but most of those that were still not hit had already taken cover. I dropped in a shell hole. None of our men was visible, but in all directions came pitiful groans and cries of pain. The scale of loss varied enormously by sector. The 46th North Midland Division suffered the lowest divisional casualties of the day at around 2,445, and its commander, Major General Montague Stuart Wortley, was nevertheless dismissed afterwards for failure to take ground. At the other extreme, the 8th Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment attacked the village of Ovillers with over 700 men. Only 68 came back. One of those who didn't return was Private Robin Biggin, a gardener from Sheffield who had only joined his battalion in France 8 days before the attack and was killed in his first time in action, aged just 19. He has no known grave and is one of more than 72,000 men with no known grave commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial. This points to one of the most devastating and culturally significant features of the first day: the PALS battalions. Recruited at the start of the war on the promise that men could enlist and serve alongside their friends, neighbours and workmates from the same town, factory or even the same street, these units meant that the casualties of a single bad morning could fall on entire communities all at once. When the Accrington PALS, officially the 11th East Lancashire Regiment, attacked near Serre, the battalion took roughly 585 casualties out of around 720 men committed in only 20 minutes. The losses were felt across the town of Accrington itself almost overnight, in a way that has become one of the most studied examples of how total industrial warfare devastated the British home front. By the end of the day, the overall numbers were almost incomprehensible. The combined British casualties for the 4th and 3rd Armies came to 57,470, of which roughly 19,240 were killed. Against this, the German 2nd Army facing them suffered somewhere in the region of 10,000 to 12,000 casualties on the same day, meaning the British were taking casualties at something close to 5 times the German rate in the worst hit sectors. It's important to note that, however, the first day was not uniformly disastrous. South of the Somme River, the French 6th Army, attacking on a narrower front against weaker German defences, achieved genuine success and advanced significantly with comparatively light losses of around 1,600 casualties. The British forces immediately north of the French, around Maricourt, the horror of the day is concentrated overwhelmingly in the northern sectors of the British attack. Gommecourt, Serre, Beaumont-Hamel, Thiepval or Villiers. Where the German defences were strongest, the landscape favoured the defender, and in some cases, the artillery preparation had been weakest. The Third Army's diversionary attack at Gommecourt alone cost 6,758 British casualties against roughly 1,212 German losses, for a position that was never even seriously intended to be held. So why, beyond the problems with the artillery bombardment, did the attack go so catastrophically wrong in so many places? There was also a combination of structural, tactical and command failures. First was the over-reliance on a single plan. The entire 4th Army battle plan assumed the bombardment would do almost all of the work. There was relatively little built-in flexibility for what should happen if the German defences weren't destroyed, and crucially, there was very limited capacity to adapt the plan in real time once the attack began. First World War era communications technology made it almost impossible for commanders behind the lines to know what was actually happening at the front in anything close to real time. Telephone lines were cut by shell fire within minutes in many sectors. Runners carrying messages on foot across a battlefield under fire took hours, if they survived at all. Commanders miles behind the line were often making decisions based on information that was several hours out of date, describing a battlefield that had already changed completely. Second was the rigid adherence to the timetable even after problems became clear. In several sectors, officers on the ground could see early in the morning that the German wire was uncut and the machine guns were active. But the rigid structure of a heavily pre-planned, synchronised, multi-division assault meant there was very limited ability to halt or adapt the attack on the fly. Waves of men kept being sent forward into fire that had already proven lethal to the wave before them, because the orders simply hadn't and often couldn't be changed in time. Third was the underestimation of the German defensive system as a whole, not just its depth, but also its sophistication. German defensive doctrine on the Somme by 1916 emphasised defence in genuine depth, with multiple lines, extensive machine gun positions sited for overlapping fire, and a willingness to hold ground tenaciously even at a very high cost, reflecting policy from the German Supreme War Command under General Erich von Falkenhayn. He insisted on rigid defence of the front line, a position he later justified after the war by arguing that the German army's manpower situation and the psychology of his troops made any policy of flexible withdrawal too dangerous to risk. Whatever the merits of that justification, it meant that the British were attacking a defensive system explicitly designed and resourced to make exactly the kind of attack they were attempting as costly as possible. Fourth and finally was the persistent gap between commanders' confidence and battlefield reality. Rawlinson's now famous assurance that nothing could survive the bombardment reflected a broader pattern in 1916 British High Command and in Haig's own diary and correspondence of significant overconfidence in what artillery and a single set piece assault could achieve against a fully developed trench system. Something that often gets lost in the popular memory of the Somme is the fact that the Somme was not just a single battle. It was an entire campaign lasting from the 1st of July to November the 18th, 1916, officially broken down into around 12 separate named battles and engagements fought in stages across that period. The British Army was not the same army on the 18th of November that it had been on the 1st of July. Tactics had evolved, sometimes successfully, often at continued enormous cost. Between the 3rd and 13th of July, further attacks added roughly another 25,000 British casualties for limited gains, as commanders continued to push forward against strong German positions in a more piecemeal fashion. But there were also some true successes. On the 14th of July, 4 British divisions launched a dawn attack at Longueville Ridge, supported by a much more concentrated artillery bombardment and, crucially, better coordination and an element of surprise, attacking before first light rather than after a long telegraphed barrage. The Germans were caught off guard and the British captured the ridge by mid-morning, advancing roughly 6,000 yards in places and taking the village of Longueval. It demonstrated that British tactics, when allowed to adapt, could achieve real results, even against the same kind of defensive system that had proven so deadly only 2 weeks before. Through the rest of the summer and into autumn, slow, costly attritional fighting continued over a series of limited individual objectives, with German counterattacks a near constant feature as both sides fed in reserves and the casualty lists grew on both sides of the line. The weather too became an enemy in its own right. By October and November, the Somme battlefield had degenerated into a landscape of mud that made movement of men, supplies and artillery extraordinarily difficult, further slowing any prospect of a real breakthrough. The battle was finally shut down by General Haig on the 18th of November, as winter weather made further offensive operations impractical. The final reckoning in terms of ground gained was startlingly modest against the human cost. Across nearly 5 months of fighting, the British and French had advanced a maximum of around 7 miles along the most successful parts of the front. There had been no breakthrough, no collapse of the German line, no decisive strategic victory of the kind the optimistic planners of June had hoped for. By almost every conventional military measure, the Somme was a disaster. It was a battle launched under diplomatic pressure rather than strategic choice, executed on the first day with a plan that collapsed catastrophically in multiple sectors, producing the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army for an advance across 5 months of only 7 miles. And yet, when we think about how the Somme actually sits in British national memory today, it isn't remembered as a humiliation in the way a clear-cut military defeat usually is. Instead, it's remembered as something closer to a tragic, heroic sacrifice. Every year on July the 1st, there are commemorations. You may have even seen them yourself today. Schools teach the POWs battalions as stories of community, friendship and loss more than as case studies in flawed tactical doctrine. The image most people in Britain carry of the Somme isn't really one of strategic failure. It's an image of pity, certainly, but also of pride, of ordinary men from ordinary towns walking forward into machine gun fire with extraordinary, unbelievable courage.